Everybody, I hope that you're enjoying the beginning of fall. As a reminder, on October 6th at midnight, your argument diagram assignment is due. I've linked both the guidelines for that as well as the op-ed that you need to diagram for this assignment in this announcement. Additionally, if you have any questions on that, feel free to send me an email. You can also send me a rough draft if you'd like some feedback from me on that. Also remember that after fall break, you'll have a little over a week as a window of time to complete the midterm exam. The midterm is on Canvas and follows a similar structure to the quizzes. So just do that and you'll be in really good shape. Otherwise, let's get started on Chapter 6. In previous chapters, we've talked a lot about building arguments, so the Tolman model and the structure of an argument. We also started talking about the ways that you might build a case, and you might build and understand a major topic. So what Chapter 6 gets into is a discussion about, now that you know the topic or the issue that's being debated, how can you make a compelling case on your side? So many of the elements that are put together, as well as the activity for this week, are designed to help you use that process in order to build a case. So one of the things that you start to see is the ways that a case kind of comes together. So a case is kind of a series of arguments, including claims, support, and so forth, that presents a series of arguments. So some of the examples that are given in the textbook, for instance, are essays or editorials, right? So a case uses a variety of different arguments in order to develop support for a point. So for instance, if someone were to say, we need to enact a carbon tax on businesses related to the environment, then they would present a case that outlines many of the major arguments and reasons that they should do that. So one of the big things when you're putting together a case is by thinking about the ultimate purpose. And when you think back to previous chapters, the ultimate purpose is, what do you ultimately want decision makers to do? What is your ideal world that you're trying to get across through argumentation? So maybe that's a world where CO2 emissions are lower and the effects of emissions are reduced. If you're talking about changes to healthcare, maybe your goal is lower premiums and costs, and so forth. So by identifying, what the major goal is, then your case can really focus on developing support and arguments that fit with that. Remember that a proposition is a major statement that kind of forms the basis of the debate. So the United States federal government should enact a carbon tax would be an example of that. The United States federal government should admit Puerto Rico as a 51st state is another example of a proposition, because you both have sides for and against that particular proposition, but you've identified that statement as a basis for either agreement or disagreement. So there are several examples in the textbook as well of what the propositions look like. Additionally, we have what's called presumption. Presumption, at least from the standpoint of decision makers, can be thought of as innocent until proven guilty. It suggests that we keep things how they are unless a case has been demonstrated that we need to change something. So for instance, if decision makers, including the government, kind of rely on the presumption that Puerto Rico does not need to be a U.S. state, then they can kind of stick to that, in which case they are sticking to what's called the status quo. The status quo is things how they are. It's business as usual. It's the world absent the actual change that the proposition calls for. So the status quo would be a world without Puerto Rico as a 51st state, whereas the case supporting the proposition says we need to make Puerto Rico a 51st state. And if they compellingly demonstrate why that needs to happen, then they've gotten through and solved the presumption that might be held by decision makers. This can be thought of in many ways related to the burden of proof, right? So the burden of proof falls on somebody who's supporting a proposition and supporting a change in order to demonstrate why that change needs to happen. So you need to demonstrate to me why we need to make Puerto Rico a 51st state. You need to demonstrate to me why we need to enact a carbon tax. You need to demonstrate to me why we need to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. All of those things are examples of requiring somebody to demonstrate why there needs to be a change from the status quo. So doing that puts the burden of proof on somebody who supports a proposition. Now, If a proposition, team, or individual presents a sufficient case, then we have what's called the burden of rejoinder. That means that the negative, or the opposition, somebody who opposes that proposition, needs to respond to and engage with that proposition. So if somebody gives a case as to why Puerto Rico should be a 51st state, then the burden falls on somebody who opposes that change to demonstrate why we shouldn't make that happen. So once that case has been demonstrated, it falls on the other side. Think about it like tennis. You hit a ball and now it's in the other side of the court. Additionally, we see that if somebody is able to create a sufficient case, we have what's called a prima facie case. And that's what's considered a sufficient case in order to justify adherence according to the textbook. So if it follows those key tenets and is able to secure some support from decision makers, then it fulfills that criteria. The textbook talks a little bit about policy debate and what you might call stock issues. That's discussed a bit on page 88, but the stock issues lay down kind of a step-by-step of ways that you can gain adherence in supporting a proposition. So is there something that should be changed? Is there some sort of harm that's preventing that change? Right? Is that inherent? Is there a barrier that's preventing that change from happening right now? Is there some sort of policy action that is going to solve that problem? And would that be a good thing? Why should we do that option? So why should we make Puerto Rico a 51st state, for instance? Additionally, we see that there are a variety of different proposals that opposition teams can, or opposition individuals can suggest as well. So one of the things that's discussed is incrementalism. So rather than, for instance, making Puerto Rico a 51st state, incrementalism would say we can make a series of small changes over time. So maybe we give them greater political representation in this way, maybe we give them a little bit more representation here and here and here, right? So rather than do a big change all at once, we could do a series of small changes. That, by the way, was something that was discussed a lot in terms of healthcare. Should we pass a series of smaller bills in order to make changes to healthcare, or a larger bill all at once? That engages a lot with incrementalism. Additionally, when you're putting a case together, right, like making really clear and well-supported arguments, so using things like the Tolman model in order to show that there's grounds and warrant and support for those arguments, and then showing why your position is ultimately correct is really important. So the contexts in which decisions happen, so for instance, the floors of the Senate and House, maybe voters in America, all of that becomes the basis for making arguments. Additionally, locating those starting points in arguments, so things like commonplaces that were discussed in chapters 2 and 3, lay out in what areas we might agree on things. So we might agree that political representation is important. We might agree that promoting the rights of territories and organizations in the United States is important too. And then from that, you can begin to develop a case that supports those things as well. So all of those things are laid out and kind of brought back in for this chapter. And then outlining the argument becomes really important, and it is a helpful thing for you to do as you start thinking about what argument you might want to do for later assignments in the class. So page 91 lays out, the ultimate purpose, the proposition, the possible issues, and then the arguments that you could make surrounding this topic too. Remember that your decision makers have their own goals, they have their priorities. So laying out a case that fits with what the decision makers are thinking about and what their concerns are really important. So if you're getting to the Department of Defense, then they're going to be really concerned about national security on things like Edward Snowden. If you're getting in front of, for instance, the Supreme Court, then they're going to care about the constitutionality and precedent of making certain rulings. So knowing the decision makers and relating to them is important. Additionally, using stories is really effective too. One of the things that former President Obama did a lot is he used a lot of personal stories. He would talk about particular individuals who might be affected by issues day to day in order to support policy changes that he wanted. And that was able to gain a lot of adherence because it was relatable and it made certain abstract concepts a bit more human. So know that those things are kind of helpful ways to lay out arguments. Other things, including how a decision is made, the rules of the spheres, and all of those things build from previous concepts discussed in the class too. So another thing related to different formats, and one thing for this week's activity, is different ways that you can organize arguments. So the stock issues paradigm that suggests there's a need for change. Identifying the world before your plan that you support, then you lay out a plan, and then you lay out why the plan is a good idea. So here's the problem, here's the solution, here's why it works. Another way you can do it is a problem-solution format. So here's the problem, and we outline the major issues related to this, and then here's the thing that will help solve that problem. And that is also outlined on page 98. So it brings about some sort of action that's suggested as a good idea. Another thing is about comparative advantage. So if you're looking at something like the Snowden case, then comparative advantage might weigh the costs and risks of doing one thing or the other. So maybe getting in, taking care of, and granting asylum to Snowden is a good idea. Or maybe like putting him under a court of law in prison is a good idea. And you're weighing the cost and benefits of those two things. Additionally, you have criteria and a definition. So this is how decision makers should evaluate the argument, and then this is how the argument fits within that criteria. So we should value political representation, and then you might show why making Puerto Rico a 51st state fits under that as well. So all of those things from pages 98 through 100 can form a backdrop for your activity this week, and you're welcome to choose whichever format you feel like makes the most sense to you. So now that you know kind of what makes good arguments and what gets discussed in terms of an issue, now you can start to think about how you can put together a proposition case and ultimately garner support for that issue. And that happens in a lot of different contexts. Not only is there like that debate context, but there's also, for instance, business meetings and roundtables, discussions with your family and friends, maybe nonprofits or other groups that you work with, all sorts of things in which laying out a sufficient case can really help make your arguments more compelling and persuasive. So I think that the real-world application of many of these concepts is really important. So that kind of summarizes things for Chapter 6. So feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions.